It's a pretty bold claim Yahya Amin makes. He's basically saying that Donald Trump's actions, things that look negative, maybe even hostile,
Right.
they actually have this unintended positive effect for Muslims, a unifying effect.
Exactly. It's definitely counterintuitive. So our goal here in this deep dive is to unpack that. Like, what's the reasoning? How can Trump's approach possibly be framed as, well, helpful?
Well, the central idea, the core of what Yahya Amin is arguing is that Trump acts as a sort of revealer.
A revealer.
Yeah, like he lifts the curtain or removes the veil. That's the metaphor used.
Revealing what exactly?
Revealing what Amin sees as the underlying reality of America and Europe, things maybe Muslims haven't seen so clearly before.
Yeah.
He argues Trump shows the real face of the West.
The real face. And how does that contrast with Yesina before?
Well, he suggests America especially has often managed to project this very positive, benevolent image, acting the angel, as he puts it, even when its actions might not quite match up.
Okay. So Trump's bluntness pierces that image. Is that the idea?
That seems to be the argument. And he uses history to back it up. Quite a bit of history, actually.
Like what?
He brings up America's treatment of Native Americans, uses some really strong language there, saying they were treated worse than dogs.
Wow.
And he connects that past treatment to current policies, like the strong support for Israel. He sees it as a consistent pattern, something fundamental that hasn't changed.
A consistent pattern. Okay,
Yeah.
Does he mention other examples?
Oh, yeah. He talks about the colonization of Australia, how European powers arrived and basically said, nobody lived here, just wiped the slate clean, ignoring the indigenous people.
Right, the whole terra nullius idea.
Exactly. Claiming innocence while taking over. He also points to the post-World War I carving up of the Middle East.
By Britain and France.
He frames those peace agreements as being purely about self-interest, setting up future problems, maybe even deliberately. And again, he links this history, this mindset, to current Western actions in the region.
So, if I'm following this, he's using these historical examples to suggest the West, particularly America and Europe, has always acted in its own self-interest, often ruthlessly, but perhaps disguised it better in the past.
That's pretty much it. And Trump, in his view, just doesn't bother with the disguise as much.
Okay. And this historical argument then leads him to challenge a bigger idea.
Definitely. He challenges the whole notion that Muslims need to look west to America and Europe to learn about civilization.
He thinks that's a mistake.
He calls it being brainwashed for the last 100 years, a very strong statement. He argues that as long as Muslims seek civilization from those sources, they'll remain, in his words, uncivilized and without backbone.
And Trump helps expose this.
How? By revealing the hypocrisy, Emin argues, by showing that the supposed source of civilization might have its own deep, deep problems.
Which brings us to the internal issues within America itself that he raises.
Exactly. He cites some pretty startling numbers. He talks about school shootings, something like 1,400 incidents in the U.S. between 2010 and 2024.
1,400 in just 14 years.
Yeah, averaging, 50 to 150 incidents a year?
Yeah.
And he adds a detail saying the majority of shooters are reportedly white Americans under 40.
Okay. And he contrasts the reaction to this.
He points to a specific shooting, I think at Florida State University, and notes how relatively little global outrage or even awareness there was compared to what might happen if a similar event occurred, say, in Afghanistan.
Right. The narrative is often very different depending on where it happens.
Precisely. So Amin asks, how can you look to a country with these kinds of internal struggles as the pinnacle of civilization?
Does he mention other internal issues?
Yeah, he touches on high crime rates, obesity levels compared to population size, also the number of people incarcerated in the U.S.
Which is known to be disproportionately high.
Very high, yeah. And he mentions social factors, too, like the percentage of children raised by single parents, and hints at potential psychological impacts. It all builds this picture of a society facing significant challenges.
So let's switch gears slightly. What about Trump himself? His motivations? Does Amin think Trump has some grand strategy behind all this?
It's interesting. He suggests Trump does have a plan, but maybe not the kind people expect. Less about complex geopolitics.
And more about?
More about headlines, grabbing attention, and crucially, according to Amin, benefiting the wealthy. The plan is to make the rich richer.
So he sees Trump viewing America as primarily for billionaires and multimillionaires.
That's the idea presented. He even speculates about things like superinflation.
How would that help the rich?
Well, the theory he discusses is that massive inflation could wipe out savings for ordinary people, but the very wealthy Those with cash reserves or easily liquidated assets could then buy up devalued assets property, businesses for cheap.
He gives
Mhm.
examples.
He mentions Bill Gates becoming the largest private landowner in America, shifting from software, tech, to tangible, real assets.
A hedge against instability, perhaps.
That perhaps Amin draws a parallel, maybe controversially, to situations like the Ayan group in Bangladesh allegedly funding political parties. He calls what happens in the U.S. a form of open corruption.
Meaning the link between money and political influence is just right there.
Yeah, maybe less hidden.
Yeah.
He points directly to Trump's tax cuts, which overwhelmingly favored corporations and the wealthy, as clear evidence.
Okay. What about things like foreign aid? Doesn't that contradict the self-interest argument?
Amin tackles that too. He uses USIIs as an example. He acknowledges it might seem helpful, but argues it can also create dependency.
How so?
He gives the example of promoting hybrid seeds in places like Bangladesh. It might increase yields initially, but it can also make farmers dependent on American or European corporations for seeds year after year, potentially harming local agriculture in the long run.
So even aid can fit into a structure that benefits the powerful.
That's his argument, that the whole system, the way America is structured, tends to channel wealth upwards. He points out that despite America's huge GDP, its public schools aren't always top-ranked globally.
Suggesting a misalignment of resources and priorities?
Exactly. And he brings up private prisons, too.
Right. The idea that there's a profit motive attached to locking people up.
He notes that the stock prices of some private prison companies apparently rose after Trump was elected. Another symptom, in his view, of a system skewed towards certain interests. He also briefly touches on problems with health insurance, mental health issues, addiction. It's a broad critique.
So, moving to the bigger picture, the geopolitical stuff, how does Trump's style fit in here?
Amin contrasts Trump's very direct, sometimes crude approach, like remember the talk about buying Greenland?
Yeah, that was something.
Right. He contrasts that with maybe the more polished diplomacy of someone like Obama. But the suggestion is the underlying goal might not be that different.
Just the packaging. Trump is more blunt about American self-interest.
That seems to be the core idea, that Trump, maybe unintentionally, reveals America's view of itself as this dominant power, maybe even uncivilized in its pursuit of control, as Amin puts it.
Does he paint all Western countries with the same brush?
Not entirely. He acknowledges there are good people everywhere, Australia, Canada, Europe, but he emphasizes that the actions of those in power are what matter on the global stage.
Okay. Any other specific geopolitical points?
He mentions, apparently referencing a leaked statement, the supposed U.S. desire to keep developing nations, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China relatively poor, to serve Western economic interests.
Wow, that's a heavy claim.
It is. And he also notes how Trump's stance towards China seemed to shift as China became more economically powerful, suggesting it's all pragmatic self-interest driving policy.
So where does all this lead? What's the takeaway for Muslims, according to Amin?
It leads to a call for, well, self-reliance, for Muslims and Muslim nations to build their own economic strength, their own military strength.
Why? To what end?
So they can negotiate with powers, like America, from a position of strength, not weakness. Not begging for favors, but dealing as equals, or at least stronger partners.
And he sees signs that this might be happening, this shift.
He observes what he sees as increasing religiosity globally. More people in mosques, observing itikaf, more women wearing hijab, men growing beards. He interprets these as signs of a potential awakening, a turning inwards.
But it's not just about religious observance, right?
No, crucially, it's about psychological and mental decolonization, as he terms it.
Decolonization of the mind.
Exactly. Breaking free from the idea that Europe and America hold the only valid models for progress or civilization.
So developing their own path.
Yes. Developing independence in advocacy. Well, everything. Fashion, storytelling, media, marketing, branding. Building their own cultural and economic power.
And economically, how?
By creating their own high-quality products and services. He points to the potential, mentioning lower production costs in places like Bangladesh's export processing zones. The idea is to build independent economic engines.
And learning from the West, in a way.
Learning how power works. Understanding that powerful nations will almost always prioritize their own interests, and that Muslim communities need to build their own strength to navigate that reality effectively.
So circling back to the start, the really counterintuitive point, Trump's actions, by being so overt, so blatant in their perceived negativity.
They inadvertently reveal these crucial truths about how the West operates, according to Yahya Amin, truths that Muslims need to grasp.
And understanding these truths isn't about despair, it's presented as beneficial.
Yes, beneficial because it's a necessary wake-up call. A catalyst for shaking off dependency, for decolonizing minds, and starting the hard work of building genuine self-reliance and progress on their own terms.
It's definitely a challenging perspective. It takes the usual narrative and flips it completely.
It really does. It positions Trump not just as an antagonist, but as an unwitting catalyst for a potentially positive shift within the Muslim world.
So it leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty big question to chew on, doesn't it?
hmm How does this analysis, thinking of Trump as this sort of accidental revealer, change how you understand global power, the West's role, and maybe the future path for Muslim communities worldwide?
Definitely something to think about. We'd encourage you to look more into the history and the current events we've touched on here. It's a complex picture.
Absolutely, lots to consider.